Well, it's the first week of spring. Well, it's the first week of spring when I did this YouTube. Maybe a few days later when you see it. And you can see the blossoms, the plum blossoms behind me. And what I want to discuss today is the concept of fundamentalism. And now, we don't think we live in a fundamentalist society. We think, people generally think they live in a free society. Now ultimately, we live in a fundamental society almost as restrictive as religious fundamentalism, whether it's Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Califumpian, whatever. And our fundamentalism is a fundamentalism based on capitalism, private investment for private profit. And over the last 40 years, we have seen the rise of an ideology which has been very good for a small minority of society, but terrible for the rest of the community, about 90% of the community, whether people realise it or not. It is disturbing to think that although we are one of the so-called richest materialist society in the world, and that we have security to a significant degree as far as shelter and food is concerned, and work is concerned, and income, the fact is that we're bedevilled by extremely high levels of stress, psychological issues and psychiatric issues. And most of them are not endogenous. That means most of them are not due to genetic makeup. They are a direct product of the fundamentalist society we live in. We live in a capitalist, fundamentalist society. And what we've seen over the last 40 years of the gains which were made over the last 150 years through strikes, protests, revolutions, petitions, slowly dissipate away. And nothing highlighted this more than the recent Albanese inspired work conference, which really didn't make any major alterations. So what is capitalist fundamentalism? Capitalist fundamentalism is based on four principles, four pillars, four foundation stones. One is deregulation. Now a lot of people think regulations can be onerous, and in many regards regulations are onerous and are there to serve the interests of the small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the investment class. But these are not the regulations that have been removed. The regulations which have been removed are those which ensure people have economic security, community security, personal security. So we see the rise of the gig economy, an economy which is based on 18th century principles of private investment for private profits with no regulations to protect the people who create the wealth. The only people that are protected are those that provide the platform and the investment for that platform to prosper. So deregulation has been an essential component over the last 40 years of the ideological drive which has made capitalist fundamentalism central to every aspect of our existence. And if you think I'm exaggerating, you try walking around the streets with no money in your pocket, or no plastic cards, or no, apps on your phone, and see what happens. See whether you will be foraging in bins around the city in order to access enough food to survive. That's what fundamentalism is about, is that when you have basic human needs which are monetarised, and if you don't have the resources to access those basic human needs, well then you personally suffer the consequences. Let's move on. Privatisation. Now those of you who watch the government-gelded Australian Broadcasting Commission will have noticed there was a four-corner program on Qantas. Now just in case you've forgotten, Qantas was owned by the federal government, not by the people, because we don't own state-owned assets. They're owned by the government of the day, which can create them and sell them at whim. Look at the deterioration in Qantas as an aircraft carrier pre the COVID-19 pandemic. Look at what happens when you have private investors who need to create a profit in order for a company to prosper. The privatisation of Qantas, which was a profit-making airline, that profit went into expanding the activities of the airline and profits went back to the Treasury, is a disaster. And privatisation is the second foundation stone of 21st century capitalist fundamentalism. And the mantra is, private is good, public is bad. Private is efficient, public is inefficient. And the fact is exactly the other way around. Look at every privatisation that has occurred in this country, whether it's at the state level or federal level or the council level. Look at the diminishment of services. Look at the situation the energy generation industry finds itself in. An industry which was state-owned is now privately owned. Because what happens when you privatise a public asset is you add a third tier to that particular organisation, and that is the private investor who needs to make a profit. So how do you make a profit? Simple. You exploit your customers, or you exploit the people who make sure that you make a profit, who do the work in your company. That's what privatisation is about. Energy, water, Qantas, telecommunications, the ports around the country, airports, titles office, Vic Roads, and the Andrews-led Labor government, the so-called socialist left Labor government in Victoria, is at the forefront of the privatisation mania. And then you extend the privatisation mania by privatising service delivery, public housing, the management of public housing. You give away publicly owned land to the private sector to build minimal public house, substandard public housing, while 90% of that land is given to them to create private homes and apartments which they sell for a profit. So privatisation has quite extraordinary effects. Look at the privatisation of the universities and the so-called expert drain we currently have. And we have that drain for one very good reason. Because over the last 30 years we have refused to a significant degree to train people. Privatising TAFE, which created tradespeople. Privatising the university and forcing them to rely on overseas students in order to survive. And then we look at the tragedy in the aged care sector. We've had Royal Commission and investigation after investigation which continues to tell us every day that the aged care services are not fit for human consumption. Look at the privatisation of early childhood development and childcare, and our fees have skyrocketed. Not because workers in those industries receive good wages, but because the investors need to have profits returned to them. Because if they don't have profits returned to them, they remove their economic support, and those industries or particular groups collapse. So these are the evils, and they are evil, of privatisation. And this is a fundamental building stone of capitalist fundamentalism in our society. And then we have this particularly noxious economic network called globalisation, where you chase the cheapest non-unionised labour force to produce goods for you at the least price, and you can bring those goods back at a cheaper price for people like us in the developed world to buy at the expense of millions, hundreds of millions, if not billions of people around the planet. No wonder. And at the same time, we close down our manufacturing industries, close down industry in this country, and basically we become a junk shop, receivers of materials which we then distribute, through our networks of privatised distribution centres. So globalisation has been shown to be a disaster. It took the COVID-19 pandemic to highlight that. But many people have realised for a long time, as they've moved from secure jobs where they had particular skills for life, producing products now pushed out into an insecure part-time work, many people have realised the evils of globalisation. Every time you pick up a phone and you try to sort something out with somebody, you'll find that you're talking to somebody overseas who's been exploited to try to sort out your technical issues, and the list goes on and on. So the level of services decreases with globalisation, the quality of the goods decrease, your manufacturing base shrinks, and most importantly of all, you lose the skill sets which are necessary to deal with emergencies, as we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, where we didn't even actually have manufacturing resources. And that loss of skills, which we now think we are going to resolve by poaching other people's skilled workers and semi-skilled workers to fill that void which should never have been created in the first place. A void which was created by capitalist fundamentalism based on globalisation, privatisation, deregulation and corporatisation. And then the fourth pillar of this decaying, evil, sick system is corporatisation. Now I feel like telling Mr. Dutton, the leader of the opposition, to zip it, to close his mouth every time he talks about how the Liberal National Party supports small business and micro business. The National Party is the agri-business party, the corporate business party. The Liberal National Party is the friends of the corporate sector. Not only is its friend, it's facilitator of the corporate sector. Corporatisation is when we see that the major aspects of our economy lie in the hands of a handful of corporations. Look at the number of hardware stores that have closed down since the introduction of the mega stores. Even neighbourhood sex stores have closed down because of the mega sex stores which are owned by corporations, just to give an example. Look at the large food corporations which dominate the distribution of food in this country and the lack of competition. Things have become so ridiculous that legislation has been passed by the Australian Competition Consumer Commission to help the Australian Competition Consumer Commission to deal with the fact there is no competition in our economy. And let's not forget, when we're told that small business is the engine room of society and that over 5 million people work in small business in this country, the fact is 90% of small businesses fail, close down within 5 years of opening because they cannot compete against corporations which have been allowed through legislation to dominate the marketplace. And this is not just ideology, it has real consequences, real human consequences. We see construction and growth for growth's sake become the coal, the electricity, the solar power, which generates the energy for this evil system of capitalist fundamentalism to continue ad nauseum. And we are the byproducts that are pushed out into society, those that need the psychiatric care, the psychological care, financial assistance, who need to rely on charities. We are the byproducts, and if you think you've got a job and you're not a byproduct, think of the increasing interest rates which are occurring now as a direct result of the type of economy we have, which is based on private investment for private profit, which is making it more and more difficult for people to access shelter, buy a home, rent, where you're spending 30, 40, 50% of your income trying to keep a roof over your head, and then spending the next 40 to 50 years repaying that mortgage, and it costs you maybe 5, 6, 7, 10 times more than the original purchase price in interest during that period. So this is what capitalist fundamentalism is all about. It's about creating a structure which may satisfy some people's desire for material goods, which leaves a significant section of the population behind, which rewards about 8% of the population in this country who are part of the investment class, who prosper because of legislation which allows investors to claim a tax deduction if they own more than one home, which allows franking credits to be paid into it. And we are all part of this system, because that 10%, that 11%, that 12%, which is set aside in superannuation, which pays for your privatised aged care. That's right, superannuation is nothing more than privatised aged care, where you pay for your own retirement through the money that you have earned, because superannuation is part of our wage system. It is not just a gift from the employer. So you've got this superannuation, trillions, which are now being invested in the stock market, the very entity which allows this rotten system, capitalist fundamentalism, to continue ad nauseum. It is not fit for human consumption. It cannot be reformed. And the final indignity is the climate emergency, which is a direct result of the growth for growth's sake ideology, which now supports, which now controls over 99% of the world's population. Only a few groups are able to survive outside that. And they want to introduce this system around the globe. And as we see developing nations like Sri Lanka go bankrupt, we see that the services they provide being privatised by the International Monetary Fund in order to repay debts which have been created by corrupt governments around this country, especially in the third and developing world, which keep most of that money and don't use it to assist the people they control and govern. So if you believe in capitalist fundamentalism, you're a fool. If you tolerate it, you're a fool. Capitalist fundamentalism is a cancer. It needs to be eradicated. It needs to be removed surgically. It needs to be killed with chemotherapy. It needs to be killed with immunotherapy. It is a blight on humanity. It's a blight on every living thing on this planet, and the climate emergency is what happens when we allow capitalist fundamentalism to dominate not just the economy but every aspect of our existence.